Hello, I'm Dr. Thomas Gidney of the University of Geneva, where I'm a postdoctoral researcher, and I currently look at the history of international organizations, as well as how colonial history interacts with these organizations.
Genève Monde, at the crossroads of history.
Hello, Thomas Gidney. Nice to see you again. Today we're going to talk about the UN. It's the 80th anniversary of the organization. The United Nations were founded in 1945 in San Francisco. Can you tell us exactly the context of that creation?
The United Nations was created at the end of the Second World War at San Francisco. And in many ways, it had many similarities to its predecessor organization, that being the League of Nations, which was based in Geneva. But it also had its differences in the sense that the United Nations was formed during the Second World War as a sort of limited group of allied states. Now, at this point, it wasn't the international organization we know today, but many of the allied states referred to each other as the United Nations. If we look at communications between Churchill, Roosevelt, even Chiang Kai-shek in China, they would often refer to each other from 1941, when the United States entered the war, as the United Nations. So it was another term for the allies, in a sense. But by 1945, it had become the veritable international organization that we know it today from the San Francisco Conference. And one of the key factors back then, and one in which we might have to evaluate the UN's work today, is collective security, coming hot off the heels of the Second World War.
Let's start with collective security. We know that that's still an issue today. Is the UN an organization that succeeds in maintaining a collective security?
The United States created the UN with a hope that it would be a more decisive organization than the League of Nations, which today many people see as the ultimate example of a failed organization due to its inability to enforce collective security and deal with many of the conflicts that broke out in the 1930s. Now, there wasn't an immediate sort of Cold War that arose directly in 1945, but can see many of the seeds of the Cold War early on in the history of the United Nations. For example, there was a lot of disagreement about the role of the Security Council. Now, the Security Council carried on from the Council of the League of Nations, in that permanent members, which were essentially the great powers of the Second World War, would have a veto on the Security Council's role in military intervention, but also actions in enforcing collective security. That the United States and Britain, to perhaps a lesser extent, wanted a Security Council that would not face the sort of deadlock that we often see today, whilst the Russians under Stalin demanded that there be a veto. And this essentially, this veto is essentially what defines much of the inactivity that we see in the UN's role pretty much from the outset. But I think that as we go along, we can see a mix of successes, especially in the early days of the UN when it comes to collective security, and perhaps more recently quite a few litanies of failure of collective security as well.
Let's take some examples. 1950, North Korea invades South Korea. What's the context and what is the role of the UN?
So during the Second World War, the Koreas were essentially divided between the northern part, which was dominated by the Russians, and then the communists under Kim Il-sung, and the south, which I can't say was a democracy. It was also an authoritarian state, but one under the patronage of the United States. And in 1950, with the blessing of Stalin, Kim Il-sung invaded South Korea. Now, Korea is a very interesting example of what many consider a success of the United Nations, even though one can debate whether the Korean War was ultimately a success from the American perspective. And one of the reasons why is that the Security Council did not necessarily function in the way that we would expect it to. So after the invasion, the Security Council launched Resolution 84, which allowed the United States to lead an intervention in Korea to restore peace. The reason why this passed, and why we rarely see examples now, was because the Soviet Union, which ordinarily would have vetoed the decision to allow the United States to lead an intervention, was boycotting the United Nations. And why was it boycotting the United Nations? Because the permanent seat on the Security Council that had been kept for China, because the China that joined the United Nations after the Second World War was the Republic of China under the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek, was being now held in 1950 by Taiwan. They had been driven off the mainland, and now the People's Republic of China had been established. And there was a lot of resistance from the United States and Britain and other Western states to allow the People's Republic of China to be the official representative at the United Nations and the Security Council. The United States was able to very successfully put together a coalition because of the fact that the Russians were not able to block it as they were boycotting the UN. Mm-hmm. This led to the intervention led by the United States, which very quickly kicked out the North Koreans from South Korea. However, as we can often see in the few cases where a UN mandate could be brought in, the United States then decided to go well beyond the mandate given to it. And this is why Korea is perhaps slightly more ambiguous. So the resolution that the United Nations had given the United States was essentially to liberate South Korea from North Korea. But the Americans decided to press beyond the borders, invade North Korea, all the way up to the Yalu River, which separates North Korea from China. Now, in this case, this provoked a very severe Chinese backlash, and the Chinese intervened. And essentially pushed the United Nations forces back to the 38th parallel, and then later to what would later be called the demilitarized line once a ceasefire was established. And this is the same line which separates the Koreas today. So on the one hand, we see the ability when some Security Council states do not participate for the UN to intervene quite effectively. On the other hand, in this case, the United States definitely exceeded the mandate that had been given to it and provoked a backlash from the Chinese. So there is that nuance about Korea.
Genève Monde, at the crossroads of history.
Another example that says a lot about successes within the UN, about international crisis. It's Suez Canal crisis. With US and USSR are not in. They let Britain and France actually deal with the problem.
So in 1956, General Nasser, who was the newish president of Egypt at this point, decided to nationalize the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal was commercially a French venture founded by Ferdinand de Lesseps in the mid-19th century, but had been under British control since the 1880s. And so essentially Britain and France had very strong vested interests to keep the Suez Canal under their control. The nationalization was heavily opposed by the British and the French, who organized a sort of secret intervention with Israel. So Israel was asked to provoke a conflict with Egypt by invading the canal, which would then bring a sort of peacekeeping mission led by Britain and France to save the canal from the Egyptians and the Israelis. But in reality, it was a way for Britain and France to reassert authority over the canal for themselves. Now, hot on the heels from the Korean War, the Russians saw that the UN was a useful tool. They realized that they should actually use the UN and use it to block American or British or French interventions. And so the Russians were again quite active in the United Nations. But Suez is one of those rare cases where it's not Russia and America at loggerheads. This is a case of America and Russia actually strangely being on a very similar page, that being critical of the traditional colonialism of Britain and France. Now, as we mentioned, a permanent member of the Security Council can veto a decision by the Security Council, which can lead to a lot of stagnation and a lot of inactivity from the UN. And in this case, Britain and France blocked the UN's ability to intervene to stop the intervention by Britain and France at Suez.
How did the General Assembly react?
So the General Assembly, which, just as a reminder, is the body through which all of the UN member states meets, not just the permanent members, reacted with great anger to the French and British intervention. And they also despised the growing deadlock that they saw at the Security Council, because they saw that the Security Council could not fulfill its mandate if a permanent member blocked it. This meant that they wanted to use another resolution that actually came up during Korea, which was Resolution 377A, which is commonly known as Uniting for Peace. So this is a General Assembly resolution, which was a way to circumvent the deadlock of the Security Council veto. And it allows the Assembly, if there's a majority, to recommend collective security measures if the United Nations Security Council does not. However, the Uniting for Peace from the General Assembly is not considered to have the same weight as any mandate from the Security Council, for the reason that it's not seen as binding, and it's seen as more of a recommendation than something that states have to do. But nonetheless, during the Suez Crisis, the strong diplomatic pressure from the United States and Russia, from the Soviet Union, but also from the General Assembly, created a lot of pressure for Britain and France to back down, which they did. And it also created another body, which we're quite familiar with today, which are the UN peacekeepers, which would have a larger role in the Cold War to come.
I want to elaborate on one thing. Russia invaded Ukraine. We see the General Assembly in the UN react strongly against this, but the Security Council is in a deadlock. So is there a parallel to do between the Suez conflict and what we knew a few years ago with the invasion of Ukraine?
So the invasion of Ukraine is not dissimilar from a pattern that would start to develop in the Cold War, which is that whenever there was an action committed by either the United States or Russia, that the veto could come into force and essentially block block any attempt from the United Nations to stop the conflict. And we see in the 1960s similar actions taken by the United States if the UN brought up any topics regarding Vietnam. And we see similar actions for the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan as well. And so in many ways, it is sadly quite a typical action that Russia was able to block any substantial UN intervention or collective security over Ukraine because of the permanent security seat it holds.
Thomas Gidney, let's talk about the Cold War, the successes and the failures. We were talking a bit before about the peacekeeping process by the UN. Can you explain exactly how these peacekeeping forces involved, let's say, in Congo, were successful or not completely successful?
So yes, the peacekeepers are established after the Suez Crisis, and they start to see a presence generally around the Middle East, around Egypt and Israel. But the Congo crisis, which really kicks off in 1960, sees one of the largest missions organized by the United Nations. And one thing that I think we should keep in mind when we're assessing successes is by the United Nations is the first, whether the United Nations had the ability to react to a conflict at all. Does it get the mandate, or is it stopped by a power? And secondly, if it gets the mandate, how effective was its mission during the mandate? So the Congo crisis of 1960 is a sort of typical Cold War one. The Democratic Republic of Congo is formed from a Belgian colony and is under the rule of the Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba, who was promptly removed from power and executed, and his body was dissolved in acid by members of the Congolese military and Belgian mercenaries to destroy the evidence. And this happened because parts of the Congo started, with the help of Belgium and some other Western powers, started to break away from the DRC. And Lumumba approached the Soviet Union for help. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of debate to what extent also the United States and other Western powers had a role in his ultimate demise.
The UN Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld was much involved in that, and he died probably as the consequence of that conflict.
Yes, actually, I was told off on my first trip to the Palais des Nations because I mentioned something about, before the investigation had actually been kicked off, there is currently an investigation, mentioning that Hammarskjöld was probably murdered, and I was told off because they said, no, this is not the official story. But it seems highly probable that he was murdered possibly by Belgian mercenaries. One mercenary in particular, who had training with the Royal Air Force, has admitted to doing it, but there are some people who cast doubts on the story. So it's currently one of the great murder mysteries. But Hammarskjöld was shot down in the Congo during the Congo crisis. But just to come back to the mission. So what happened was that the United Nations, under the mandate to restore peace, but also to restore the territorial integrity of the DRC, operated a mission called UNOC, United Nations Operations in the Congo. And this was perhaps the largest peacekeeping mission that the UN has ever established. So it brought in about 20,000 soldiers from 30 General Assembly members. What is also quite notable is that none of these troops were, or very few of these troops were from the permanent member states. So they were actually from Smaller members, notably India, Ethiopia, were some of the states that sent the most troops to the Congo. And UNOC was highly successful in its mission of ending the succession of the main region, which was Katanga. And by early 1962, that essentially reoccupied Katanga for the DRC. And this occupation continued until 1964, when the peacekeepers left the Congo. So in this regard, the peacekeeping mission was very successful. And it was successful for reasons that we often don't see today with peacekeeping missions, especially when we think of the 90s, which we'll come to later. And it's because that they were given a very strong mandate to essentially launch offensive operations into Katanga to reunite the country. And because of this, there have actually been accusations of atrocities committed by UN peacekeepers during this conflict, of violence against civilians, for murder, even potentially of some UN and humanitarian staff also accidentally being killed by UN peacekeepers. So in this regard, they had a strong mandate and they were able to be quite successful compared to what we're used to with peacekeepers. But there were also some downsides. Furthermore, once the peacekeeping mission departed, the Congo remained highly unstable. And the year after the mission left, the country was taken over by the military kleptocrat Mobutu, who ruled the Congo until the 1990s. So we can really ask ourselves whether that was a great success story for the Congolese people.
Genève Monde. History, memory, testimonies.
Moving on to other situations in the 90s, two examples, Rwanda and ex-Yugoslavia. Srebrenica, it was 30 years ago that the massacre, the genocide, we could say, took more than 8,000 lives in Bosnia. What was the role of the UN at that time? We know for a fact that we put that mission in a category of failures, major failures. Can you explain why?
The massacre at Srebrenica against Bosnian Muslims was ultimately a failure because there were actually peacekeepers at Srebrenica, Dutch peacekeepers, who were there to protect many of the refugees and civilians there, who essentially stood idly by whilst the Serbs or Bosnian Serbs essentially ethnically cleansed and killed pretty much all the men at Srebrenica. So it's seen as one of the great failures. So we have to ask ourselves, why were peacekeepers so impotent? And we see this particularly in the case of Yugoslavia and of Rwanda, when we know that the peacekeepers actually had a history of having, especially in the Congo, a mandate where they could actually be more aggressive. And there are multiple reasons. Mostly, again, comes down to the impasse at the Security Council. So the UN has to give a mandate to what the mission is. And in Congo, the mandate was for peacekeeping troops to effectively engage in an offensive against Katanga. In Yugoslavia, the issue here was that the Serbians, who were closely aligned with the Russians, who were not keen for the UN to give a strong peacekeeping mandate which could see the UN respond in a more aggressive manner. So peacekeeping operations were kept in a sort of more defensive way. Secondly, many of the peacekeepers were poorly armed. They did not have, they had guns, but they were not like heavily armed with artillery or any support weapons, whilst many of the Serbians were. And we can say the same thing in Rwanda, that many of the peacekeepers were heavily outnumbered by their potential adversaries. So there was also a question of the security of the peacekeepers that was often brought up at the UN. So this was really seen as one of the great failures because in both cases, in Rwanda, where there was a Belgian peacekeeping mission, and in Srebrenica, where there was the Dutch peacekeeping mission, both stood relatively idly by when people were being massacred because the mandates that were given to them, as well as the weaponry and the ability to fight back, was limited.
We have examples now of Russia, Ukraine, and also Syria recently. The UN, after the invasion of Russia in Ukraine, couldn't really operate. The missions were really limited. How can you explain that it's in front of our eyes and the UN seems completely inefficient?
Again, from the very foundation, the permanent veto from the Security Council is the Achilles heel of the United Nations. And this essentially seems almost textbook for the role of the United Nations. It is a state that invades another state, versus some of the more complicated conflicts we see, which are civil wars. This is what the UN was created for. But the fact that one of the permanent council members is the one doing the invasion means that the UN essentially can do very little to stop Russia in this regard. Interestingly, though, we could also look at one of the rare examples, and this was debated early on, of the League of Nations, which had a case in which, when the Soviet Union invaded Finland in the winter of 1939, the Soviet Union was actually kicked out of the League of Nations. And we've actually never seen this done at the United Nations. And I feel that this is because the UN prefers to have, even in the case where one state has committed an egregious offensive act, the ability to retain the discussion through its large multilateral forum. So currently we don't really see much punishment like being thrown out of the organization for acts of aggression like this.
Though Vladimir Putin or Benjamin Netanyahu recently, through the Court of Justice in The Hague, had to respond about their acts. And so of course, it's not the UN directly, but still it's an international court of justice. So what do you say? There's still a way to point at the responsibilities of certain leaders and to, prosecute them.
There's still the possibility of states clearly showing their displeasure. I mean, the General Assembly clearly wasn't happy with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But when we're talking about the Security Council, we're really talking about the UN's concrete ability to intervene and enforce collective security. And without the unanimity, or at least not having a state bloc, because some states can also abstain from the vote. But without the unanimity of the Security Council, it's very, very difficult to actually have an effective security response. And thus, states like Ukraine are reliant on bilateral help from states that are willing to help them, rather than having all of the UN member states kind of come down on Russia for its invasion.
Genève Monde, at the crossroads of history.
Now there's another theme we have to go through. It's humanitarian aid. Of course, it's very important in the story of the UN. We talk about peacekeeping, collective security. What role has humanitarian aid in the organization, the UN, after 80 years, as it developed to become one pillar of the UN missions?
So if we say that the UN's history with collective security has certainly been checkered, full of maybe a few successes but many failures, I would argue that its role in humanitarian aid has been much more successful. Now, it wasn't necessarily one of the main initial founding roles for the United Nations. It was certainly there was some level of aid by its predecessor, the League of Nations, but the UN has certainly developed and expanded massively, especially since the 90s, in its humanitarian aid role. Now, I like to call this the more Geneva side of the United Nations, because many of the aid organizations are based in Geneva, as opposed to the Security Council, which is in New York. But we can see a litany of very important agencies which do many different roles around the world. There's a World Food Programme that provides food assistance. They're obviously like the UNHCR, which essentially helps supply and also register and discuss between states the needs of the rapidly growing population of refugees we see around the world as the number of conflicts proliferates. UNICEF, which delivers aid to disadvantaged children and families. The WHO, World Health Organization, that helps with medical care, but also the delivery of vaccines, and has successfully led programs such as the eradication of smallpox, which I think is one of the great humanitarian success stories, which doesn't always necessarily capture the same attention that a conflict might, but in many ways has probably saved millions upon millions of lives, as well as currently the WHO's program to eradicate polio, which a few years ago was quite close, and fortunately I think is now, because of conflict, becoming more difficult.
When we talk about humanitarian aid, we talk about budget. And of course, these days there's a crisis. Cuts have become a major issue since Trump is in power. And it seems to reshape completely the organization of the UN. and some of agencies have to relocate or cut programs. So can you tell us about that story of cuts? Because it's not new. There have been a lot of cuts in the past. So how can you present the situation now in regard to the history of the UN?
There's several things to take into account. The first is, again, that the UN's mandate for humanitarian aid has increased massively over time. And today, as opposed to the Cold War, we see a lot more humanitarian aid and programs being carried out than what used to be the case. But we also have to understand that the United States is the largest, by far the largest, funder of the UN humanitarian system. In many ways, this shouldn't surprise anyone. It is essentially the foundational state that pushed for the creation of the United Nations system. It wasn't necessarily China. It was to a lesser extent Britain, but obviously it was a much smaller and less important country. Unfortunately, I have to say for my own my own nation. But there it is. Even though Britain has also historically given quite a lot of humanitarian aid. So the UN has been in crisis for its humanitarian funding for quite some time, especially since Trump won. So the first Trump presidency in 2016, we see that Trump already starts to freeze a lot of aid, and he starts to come after some of the organizations he doesn't like very much. Some are also organizations outside of the United Nations as well. I mean, such as the World Trade Organization, where we see a lot of the battles over trade policy with China. And then when COVID comes, we see the WHO also get sidelined by the United States too. But what we're currently seeing in the first few months of Trump 2 is a much deeper, a much more significant cut of the United States budget. And this is also largely because of the new administration's attempt to cut US aid, which is a very significant aid organization, one of the most significant, founded by President Kennedy in the early 1960s.
But Thomas Gidney, let me ask you a controversial question maybe. Is the budget that is allowed, is the money is well spent?
This has been a perennial question with any international aid, whether it's through the UN or even direct. Is the money well used? And there's certain responses to that. I mean, people have accused money that's given directly to countries and developing nations to be misused, perhaps either for influence or outright corruption. And also in the case of the United Nations, there's the question of whether having all these highly paid functionaries living in Geneva, which is one of the most expensive cities in the world, is the best use of money. And there have been also other critiques, is Geneva and many of the agencies in New York and in Europe, are they close enough to the places where the money is being spent? And the UN has responded to this, by opening offices in Nairobi, for example, which is closer to where some of the money is spent. Obviously, a lot of aid is given to Africa, despite the fact that there is certainly some waste. I mean, there's waste in every expenditure. I would say that if we're looking for the impact in lives saved, I don't think you could really have a better expenditure than some of the work that the UN agencies do. And we have to remember, even though the numbers in the UN budget might look big, they're not that large when we compare it to some national budgets. So if we look at the United Nations core functioning budget, we're looking at around $3.5 billion. And its total budget among all its agencies is around 75 billion. So these are large numbers, but they're not indistinguishable from a secondary powers defense budget. We could see, Britain's currently increasing its defense budget. Russia maybe is probably slightly above that. So for all the humanitarian work that is conducted, it's quite a small amount. Secondly, if we compare it to perhaps the United States government's budget, which is close to $7 trillion a year, it's really a drop in the ocean. And if I dare say, if we can compare it to the personal wealth of some people nowadays, with billionaires such as Elon Musk, who apparently have fortunes somewhere between $300 to $400 billion, I think just to give you some perspective, it doesn't seem like that much money considering what is achieved with some of the funds.
Genève Monde, the shared history of international Geneva.
Let's talk about Palestine, UNRWA, and we saw after the beginning of the reaction of Israel after the events of the 7th of October of 2023, that there was a political problematic. Is there Hamas members within an organization held by the UN? And it drove lots of countries to decide to stop or to diminish their contribution to UNRWA. What do you think of that? This is a good example of some criticism aimed at the UN, like it's too political sometimes, on local grounds, like in Palestine.
The UNRWA example is not even necessarily an original example of how states have withdrawn funding based on even the question of Palestine. Famously, I think in the 1970s, the United States withdrew from UNESCO because it recognized Palestine as a member state. So I think that perhaps some states were slightly premature from leaving UNRWA because the case hadn't been fully investigated to see to what extent some members of the UN had been part of or had supported Hamas. But it's quite clear now that there is certainly a politicization about which organizations people want to come and choose. I gave the example of the World Health Organization earlier. And recently the United States has also decided to leave the Human Rights Council too. So I think that it's difficult for the UN to completely maintain a level of neutrality, especially in some conflicts which are so drawn out, such as the Israel-Palestine conflict. And that can certainly cause issues when agencies' core functions, such as essentially providing aid to Gaza, cannot impede the political actions of major countries like the United States and Israel.
So one question, Thomas Gidney, 80 years after the foundation of the UN, is the multilateral system changing to the point that it could disappear?
I think that it's not improbable that we could see the United Nations going the same way as the League of Nations. And it sounds like a pessimistic, perhaps even an extreme outlook, but I think that looking at the very rapid political change, I think that it has to be something that people see on the horizon. I think that the UN is often criticized for failing in its security role, as we've discussed, regarding the conflict in Palestine, the conflict in Ukraine, even the civil war in Syria. And now we're seeing many more conflicts. I mean, just this morning when we were recording, we've seen some artillery shelling between Thailand and Cambodia. Mm-hmm. So we're starting on the collective security front to see lots of smaller outbreaks of little conflicts around the world. And it's true that if there's no multilateralism in this regard, we could be in a situation where we're going back to something akin to the 19th century, where states, and because many states do have outstanding claims on each other's land, might decide to do limited wars to enforce things rather than negotiate them. On the other hand, one has to ask whether the United Nations universality, having pretty much every member state in the organization, is actually effective for it. As I think I tried to mention at the beginning, the UN was not necessarily created with the idea of having every single member state in, because they realized that it would essentially hamper the organization, because if you had every member state, any conflict was going to be automatically between two states rather than between one which was a member and one which was not. Mm-hmm. This is called quantitative membership of an organization versus qualitative. So if we look at the European Union, for example, it's got a membership based on regionalism. They won't have China as a member state of the European Union, for example, because it has a clear mandate that it's based for European states, or other organizations which might have a more focused remit that only has a few members in, rather than every single member state of every single state on the planet. But the benefits of this multilateralism is that it does mean that people can debate and discuss things, and it keeps an open door and an open voice for states to discuss things. It doesn't mean that we're going towards more bilateralism, workarounds. I think the WTO offers a very interesting example, because the United States has frozen one of its main roles, which is to adjudicate between states if one decides to put trade barriers or tariffs on another state. And by blocking essentially the judicial part of the WTO, it means that it's a bit like the Security Council in many ways, not being able to do things for the UN. States have tried to find workarounds by creating groupings, bilateral groups. And so it is possible that, yes, we might see groups of states try and work around the system. But as I was saying, if the collective security part doesn't work, and now the humanitarian side of the organization doesn't work, we could start to see the UN enter a sort of death spiral. States will start to question, what is the point? Why do I pay these contributions? The organization neither provides any security, nor does it provide sufficient humanitarian aid. The quality of the UN's work might also decrease from not having sufficient aid. And so you'll probably see more stories of projects failing or projects going into the wrong hands because there might not be enough surveillance as to where the aid goes. And so over time, because of the aid cuts, the quality of the aid decreases. People say, why should I give more money? And currently this debate's already happening. I mean, in Britain, again, the country, Britain has decided to allocate some of its international aid budget towards greater military expenditure. Switzerland, too, has also announced aid cuts. And so I think that the United States' decision to freeze and cut aid will set a precedent for other states to do the same in turn. The other countries haven't necessarily looked for leadership start to fill in the role. And I'm talking, I think I'm talking about China, really. Will other powerful states with a similar GDP to the United States fill in the same role? The question is probably to some extent yes and to some extent no, depending on which organizations the Chinese value, where they would like to see more influence and what's valuable to them. But I don't think we'll necessarily see the Chinese fill in the financial gap that the United States has left.
Genève Monde, the shared history of international Geneva.
One last question is about Geneva. Geneva is impacted by this crisis, and we start to hear about agencies trying to relocate somewhere else. What do you think of this situation from a Geneva perspective? Are we going to lose here the power that had the city so far since the League of Nations because of that crisis?
This debate slightly pre-exists the second Trump administration, and as I said earlier, there was a sort of debate as to whether the UN's institutions should be closer to where its aid is being spent, hence a move towards places like Nairobi in Kenya. And I think it's to sort of shed the inherent elitism there is of having lots of, again, highly paid functionaries earning tens, if not hundreds of thousands of francs working in Geneva. And that's also part of the fact that Geneva is a very expensive city and you can't really live without similar salaries. But it is now a question of necessity. It's no longer a question of, do we want to appear kind of more approachable? It's a question of, can we have the budget to actually fund all these functionaries? Now, the downsides of obviously going to, currently there's people discussing about moving agencies to Vienna, or at least some staff to Vienna, to Lisbon, perhaps Qatar, is whether we start to lose the network effect of having lots of different agencies in the same place. Because different agencies have quite specialized roles, and having a sort of central area where different people can get in the same room to discuss their mission, to ensure that perhaps there's some convergence in the work they do, or that they don't actually have too much overlap sometimes, because sometimes you have different agencies that might end up doing identical work, is important. So it can help coordination, also helping write reports, having different experts in the same place who can discuss things, I think does mean that having a sort of nexus, a hub like Geneva, is quite powerful. But I do certainly understand the argument for also trying to be closer to where your aid is being spent. But right now it's, people are frantically looking for places to relocate to just to cut funds. And it might be done in a way which leads to quite negative outcomes, I think, for the United Nations.
Thank you very much, Thomas Gidney. One more word is that you have published a book. Give us the title and tell us also if you work on something else.
Yes, so my book came out a couple of months ago. It's called An International Anomaly, Colonial Accession to the League of Nations. And as aforementioned, the League of Nations is the sort of forerunner to the United Nations. And it leads to an interesting question as to whether colonies, these are European colonies, notably Canada, Ireland, India, Australia, South Africa, could become member states of international organizations. And in my book, I look at the international legal loopholes, but also the political wranglings which allowed colonies such as India, which had no self-governing institutions really, besides those run by Europeans, in the 1920s and 30s and how it acceded to the League of Nations. But it also carries on, interestingly, into the United Nations and asks some interesting questions today. When the UN was founded, the British, again, pushed for India to join, and India joined the United Nations as a colony once again, as did the United States, which pushed for the Philippines, which was also an American colony, to join as a founding member. Now, this provoked a response from Stalin, who was not happy at the fact that the British and Americans were trying to include their colonies. And so he said, if you do this, I will include every Soviet republic within the USSR as a member state of the UN. And then the United States said, well, I'll put every American state in. And you can see that this was going to cause a fracture and a sort of loss of legitimacy. So in the end, there was a compromise in which India and the Philippines joined. They would become independent very, very soon afterwards in 1947, in exchange for Belarus and Ukraine becoming founding members of the United Nations, simply by attending the founding conference at San Francisco of the United Nations. And of course, they would not become independent states until 1991. But it also asks this sort of strange anomaly that we see in membership, questions about autonomous bodies today who are seeking membership. For example, I got a very interesting question a couple of years ago about Greenland, which is a autonomous part of Denmark. It might seek independence, but some people were even looking at the possibility of Greenland as an autonomous part of Denmark becoming a UN member state. And I think as of a couple of weeks ago, New Caledonia, which is a French territory in the Pacific, is also going to become autonomous with the right to manage its foreign affairs. There's questions whether New Caledonia could be a member of the United Nations too. But it also, bear in mind, leads to a very interesting point that despite the failures that we're seeing at the United Nations today, UN membership is still highly attractive to both its member states, many of whom prefer to be in an organization where almost every state on earth currently attends, but also for states in waiting, polities that are seeking full international recognition, such as Kosovo, Taiwan, or Chinese Taipei, which is currently the Chinese name for Taiwan, Greenland, and of course Palestine, all of which have sought UN membership and the international recognition it brings. So in that regard, the UN is still quite powerful in what it can bring for international recognition, for sovereignty. And one has to remember that unlike the League of Nations, no member state has ever left the UN. Little asterisk, despite a very small departure from Indonesia in the 1960s, but it came back afterwards. So it is, in that regard, quite robust in terms of its membership. And I suppose that is one angle in which we can have a bit of hope for the future of the United Nations.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank our sound engineers today, Thibaut Mecheroub, and also Patrice Morel for the RTS, who helped us to record today that interview. And also, I would like to thank David De Rodogno from the Graduate Institute, who put us in touch. So that's one thing to say.
genevemonde.ch